Hey guys, welcome back to a new episode of Bolt Breakdowns with Alex here on the Guilty as Charged podcast YouTube channel. I'm, of course, your host, Alex. We did talk about the wide receivers last week and the 4 questions that I had for the wide receiver group. So I want to move on to a new position this week and talk about the quarterbacks. While not really a position group in the way that we think about, because Justin Herbert is clearly the quarterback. You do have Chase Daniel and Easton Stick, and a lot of questions that need to be answered about all 3 of them in regards to 2021, as well as their futures potentially on the team. So that is why I want to talk about this group specifically, because I do have some questions. But first, I do want to shout out Manscaped, which is ironic because someone has pointed out that I do look like this right now. So I will be using my Manscaped line of products, including the Lawnmower 4.0, to shave this off of my face. So you can use code GUILTY at checkout and get 20% off your first purchase. But let's move on to the main topic of this episode, which is, of course, the quarterbacks. And there's no better place to start than with Justin Herbert. And I think that's ultimately where we start this episode. So that's the first question. Does Justin Herbert experience a real sophomore slump? This is something that has been debated. Steven actually did an article on LAFB talking about the history of sophomore slumps and all of the quarterbacks that have either gone through them or not gone through them. But I think this is kind of a good breakdown. This is from Coast Scouting, coast-to-coast-scouting.com, where you do have quarterbacks like Sam Bradford, RG3, Dak Prescott, and Baker Mayfield, who did experience sophomore slumps, particularly Baker Mayfield did, and they categorize sophomore slump as a notable decrease in completion percentage, touchdown percentage, passer rating, and QBR. So you do have that, but alternatively, there have been guys that have excelled in their second years in the league. Obviously, you start with Carson Wentz, who was notably an MVP candidate, but you also have Derek Carr, Josh Allen, and Kyler Murray, who saw sizable improvements in completion percentage and those metrics that we mentioned before. Kyler Murray, particularly working with that Cliff Kingsbury offense, still found a way to excel in his second year. So, you know, it's not really a real will Justin Herbert experience this or not. I think the answer can also be somewhere in the middle. Just because Justin Herbert's numbers decrease, as some people in the fantasy community are worried about because of Joe Lombardi, that doesn't necessarily mean that he experiences a sophomore slump. Because to me, the sophomore slump means that the quarterback is actually playing worse in his second year in the NFL than he did in his first. And so I do think the legitimate thing to worry about is that defenses and defensive coordinators in particular will have a full season of tape, as they mentioned here in this SI article, and that could really kind of limit his success and cause a statistical decline. But I think it's a little early to say that that will cause an actual decline. I do think there is a difference. Just because Justin Herbert throws slightly fewer touchdowns or slightly more interceptions doesn't really mean that that's the case. But I do think Lombardi, if you don't consider him an elite signal caller to this point yet, has the potential to make Justin Herbert regress, but I don't think that that's the only outcome either. And he was nothing short of spectacular in his first season. So to me, the sophomore slump question is a bit of a wait and see, but even if Justin Herbert does have a statistical decline, I don't think that'll be enough to actually cause a sophomore slump. But and one thing that PFF brings up a lot is the idea that Justin Herbert's success under pressure is unsustainable going forward. But the argument to that will be, well, even if he's not facing as much pressure going forward, you know, he's still going to be good, right? You know, even if you're saying basically that he's not going to have that success under pressure, he's also not going to be facing that much pressure, right? You do have Corey Linsley, Rashawn Slater, Matt Filer, and all of those guys there now, which is just night and day compared to a line that had Sam Tebby and Forrest Lamp and Dan Feeney on it. So I think the fact that you're going to have a quarterback who will be facing much less pressure really nullifies that point. And PFF and many advanced analytics people have said as much themselves in regards to the Chargers' new and improved offensive line. So it's TBD on Justin Herbert experiencing a real or actual sophomore slump, but I don't think it's overly likely. The second question that I have, and this is actually something that I think has gone under the radar. What does the new quarterback coach mean for Justin Herbert? And so the Chargers are going from Pep Hamilton, who did incredible work last year, to now Shane Day. There is a lot of discussion about Joe Lombardi and what that will mean for the playbook and Justin Herbert, but not a lot of people have talked about the fact that Pep Hamilton is gone. I think it's too early to say what effect that'll have on it, but it's something that I think is worth mentioning because if Justin Herbert really has kind of sped up his processing and the game is slower to him now, that could really mean a big leap for him as opposed to sophomore regression. But I think only time will tell with this one. I don't know a ton about Shane Day other than, we've discussed on the show that he is kind of a student of the Shanahan system, obviously coming from San Francisco. So I think it'll be interesting to see what he does differently in comparison to, say, Pep Hamilton. Also different situations because Shane Day is taking a clearly ascending quarterback versus Pep Hamilton was more responsible for development of a rookie quarterback. So different situations, but I'm curious to see how those guys deal with it. And unfortunately for Pep Hamilton, I do feel sorry that he is with the Houston Texans now. Number 3, is it Chase Daniel or Easton Stick as the backup? So this quote kind of went under the radar back in April. Chargers head coach Brandon Staley says they're excited about quarterback Easton Stick. Quote, "We really like this guy. There's going to be a good competition between those two." He didn't outwardly say it, but he did seem to say that only the Chargers will only carry 2 quarterbacks. I think that is the likeliest result that we'll have. And unlike last year, there will be a training camp and a preseason to really determine who's better between those 2 quarterbacks going forward. And I think the fact that they're not carrying 3 quarterbacks, which we'll get to in a bit, really brings up what is the future of Easton Stick on this roster, because Chase Daniel, if he does lose that quarterback battle, will not really have a future on this roster. They will just roll with Justin Herbert and Easton Stick at that point. But if it's Chase Daniel that's the backup and they're still waiting on Stick, does that create a situation in which Stick will be cut or is he practice squatted? Both of those are kind of interesting points. For me, I kind of have to give the edge to Chase Daniel here just because he does have experience with this coaching staff in particular. And also you do have to remember that Daniel, has been an NFL quarterback. I mean, he's come into games and just has such a big experience advantage over Stick. Stick may have developed from the last time that we saw him in a preseason game in 2019, but unfortunately we haven't been able to see what he is now. So I'm curious to see if this preseason reveals that he's actually a different quarterback that has developed, or is he still kind of the same Easton Stick? But the way that I put it on the podcast is, even if we're saying Easton Stick has a really good preseason against second and third stringers, and say goes for 6 touchdowns and 2 interceptions in 3 games, is that really enough to knock off Chase Daniel, who has all of this veteran experience, especially when come regular season, if Justin Herbert has to sit out a game or is injured mid-game, you want the guy who's done that for a long time in Chase Daniel. So I think that'll be interesting to watch going forward. And that brings us to the final question that I have for the quarterback group, which is, in all likelihood, I do think Chase Daniel will be QB2. At that point, do the Chargers still view Easton Stick as an asset? Obviously, Easton Stick was drafted in 2019. We sort of remember being a little bit surprised at the pick, but the argument for that at the time was, hey, you just draft this quarterback, see if he's an asset, and see what you can do with him going forward. And at the time, obviously, the Chargers did not think they were going to go 5-11 in 2019 and have a top sixth pick in 2020, which led them to drafting Justin Herbert. So they clearly went in a different direction than they expected to go at the time then they drafted Stick. And when they drafted Stick, they just viewed him as a developmental piece that may or may not come along. That was really the attitude when they did draft him. Easton Stick was never promised to be the quarterback of the future per se, but I still think it's interesting to see if they think he's an asset. This is a new coaching staff, particularly one that didn't draft Easton Stick. So this goes back to the whole, will the Chargers carry 2 quarterbacks or will they carry 3? Because I think in all likelihood, if you're cutting Easton Stick, then it's sort of the end of that experiment. However, the Chargers could also say, well, we do still view him as an asset, and maybe if we continue to develop him and he has a good preseason, it's worth having Stick on the roster because perhaps in the future we can flip him in some kind of deal, right? Which means you would get a 5th or 6th, 7th round pick for Easton Stick if people have seen enough development from him. And by that, I mean particularly other NFL GMs around the league. I think at this point that's unlikely, but because they spent a 5th round pick in 2019 on him, which, isn't the end of the world in terms of draft compensation, they still may be looking to get something back, even if it's very clear at this point that Justin Herbert is the quarterback of the future, and there's not really a long-term future for Stick. They may still want to develop him into a backup, or if you view Chase Daniel as the backup, try to flip him for some kind of draft compensation in the future. But that is it for this video. In the 4 questions that I have for the QB depth chart, let me know what you think and answer these comments in the questions down below. Let me know what questions you have about the Chargers QBs. Who do you favor, Stick or Daniel? Let me know in the comments down below. I'll be responding there all day, at least in terms of your criticisms and what you think. But yeah, let me know what you guys think, and I will see you guys next time.